Grace Mitchell had woken up that Saturday with a mixture of nerves and hope. She had chosen a simple navy blue dress that didn't stand out too much. Attention, but you gave security, and combed his hair same in front of her mirror small apartment in Midtown. It wasn't the designer clothes that your sister Victoria used to flaunt it on social media, but for Grace it represented something deeper. The intention to be present in a moment that, in theory, it should be familiar and emotional. While adjusted a pair of discreet earrings inherited from her mother, she repeated to herself that, perhaps that day, it would be different if Victoria I would look not like the less successful sister, but as a fundamental part of her life. The St. Regis Hotel in Fifth Avenue imposed from the entrance an air of elegance that made anyone feel out of place if it didn't fit with a luxury level. Grace arrived early, as was his habit in his work and in everything he did. He walked to the reception with a smile contained and delivered his name to the manager, hoping to see your surname written in the list. However, the employee took too long to respond. He moved the top-down view in the leaves printed, turned pages and went back, until he lifted a look of a mixture of discomfort and coldness. "He's not here," he said, in a low voice. In that moment, the murmur of the guests, the clinking of glasses and the echo of a distant piano became in a painful backdrop. Grace's name had been erased from his own marriage sister. Grace tried to solve it calmly. He showed his identification, explained that it was the sister of the girlfriend, and asked for another check. The manager called another person. They were talking about the tablet, and the answer continued the same. No figure. In order not to create a scene, he moved to a corner from the lobby and called Victoria. The call went unanswered. Minutes later, she received a short, impersonal, written message almost like an administrative note. It was clear that his presence was not necessary, and that everything would be better if she avoided inconvenience. There were no explicit insults, but the subtext was violent. She was not welcome because, in the eyes of the sister, did not represent the kind of success they wanted display that day. Grace felt the heat rises to the neck. That a mixture of shame and anger that forces you to breathe through your nose to avoid breaking. Down. Around. Two guests looked her dress as if it were a logistical problem. The piano of the lounge followed ringing, indifferent. If you've come this far, it's because you once felt that knot in the throat when minimized by your own family. To support these types of stories and for more people to hear them leave your like and tell me from what city you are seeing this. Read where they accompany us from. Helps these stories not feel solitary. After saving the phone, Grace took a breath and decided not to argue with the hotel staff. I knew a scene would only confirm the stereotype that your family used against her. It smoothed out the dress, straightened the shoulders, and left from the St. Regis with measured steps. Outside, the afternoon in Fifth Avenue continued its course. Impatient taxi drivers, tourists with shiny bags, the smell of coffee escaping from the doors revolving. He walked a block without looking back, not out of pride empty, but because she had learned to protect the little piece that still remained. Inside her bag, a sealed envelope weighed more than any handbag. It was the limit and, at the same time, the beginning. Grace did not walk long before stopping in front of a café small, one of those that passed by unnoticed among boutiques and offices. He entered, asked a black tea and sat next to the window. While the steam rose from the cup, discreetly opened her bag and touched the envelope. Inside it contained a message that he had prepared months in advance, a gesture that, in another context, it must have been a gift for his sister. It was the confirmation of a purchase, a $2.8 million penthouse in Manhattan. The original plan was to deliver it in the banquet as a symbol of reconciliation, as proof that Grace, in his way, too, had triumphed. Now, in that worn wooden table, the envelope acquired another meaning. It was no longer a bridge, it was a mirror in the one Victoria would have to look at. The irony he has not escaped. Victoria always had boasted of connections, of parties with businessmen, of custom-made dresses. What no one I knew that, behind that shine, Grace had become senior vice president at one of the world's largest real estate management companies. She, the supposed sister, invisible. He wore years closing contracts that moved unimaginable figures for the most of the guests who now thee had excluded. Did not need explanations, but the pain continued there, latent. While as he watched people walk along the sidewalk, he began to think about as a single gesture, a single decision, could change the script of the entire celebration. The tea was getting cold, and with each sip I understood more than the envelope could not stay hidden in her bag. Grace returned to the hotel with firm steps, but without make noise. He didn't look for his sister, neither tried to enter the reception, simply handed over the envelope to an assistant who recognized his surname and he took quickly towards the reserved area. She didn't explain anything, she didn't give details. He only asked that it reach Victoria's hands. Then he turned on his heels and walked out to the street, mixing with the passers-by as if it had never been there. Its heart beat with strength, not of fear but of anticipation. I knew that, sooner or later, someone would open that envelope, and the weight of the true would fall on every table full of glasses and toasts. He walked toward the south of the avenue, seeking refuge in the anonymity of the crew. Within the living room, the scene, it was different. Victoria, smiling, surrounded by her fiancé's partners and investors, opened the envelope with the expectation of finding a check, a personal note, or maybe some awkward detail that could discard. What he found the let without words. A Blackstone corporate card with the name of your sister and the position of senior vice president. At first, she thought it was a joke, but it was enough for two of those present regular clients of the firm to confirm in a low voice that they knew so that the air would become thick. The conversations died down, smiles froze, and the rumor of the orchestra, it seemed, interrupted. Victoria had tried to erase her sister of the event, but Grace's presence had just become larger than any floral arrangement or prepared speech. The news spread like wildfire inside the living room. Some guests, credulous, began checking their phones to confirm what they had just heard. Yes, Grace Mitchell appeared in financial statements. Yes, it had been present in closures billionaires of the company. Suddenly, the bride perfect. He stopped being the center of attention, and the shadow of his sister became in the main theme of the night. Victoria tried to recover. He raised the voice to toast, but the murmur already the had devoured. The weight of the humiliation was impossible to hide. And the investors' expressions began to change, from admiration to doubt, from confidence to caution. Grace, oblivious to that show, dined alone in a nearby restaurant. I had ordered a salad and a glass of wine white, enjoying a silence he rarely had in his life. His cell phone vibrated. Non-stop 47 missed calls from Victoria, messages, endless excuses and pleas mixed together with veiled threats. He didn't respond to any of them. He allowed himself, for the first time in years, the tranquility of eating at your own pace, of observing life through a picture window without feel judged. That night understood that peace is not always arrives with grand reconciliations, but with the decision simple not to back down from those who despise you. While at the St. Regis the discomfort multiplied, Victoria groped to regain her composure attention of those present. Her fiancé, Robert, tried to calm the investors, assuring them that everything was a misunderstanding. But the damage was done. A couple of businessmen with who I hoped to close deals, millionaires, they took advantage of the confusion to withdraw discreetly, leaving behind him an empty much more eloquent than any word. The wedding, which was to be his great social showcase, had been transformed into a scenario of doubts. Nobody spoke already of the ceremony. Everyone was talking about Grace, the forgotten sister who turned out to be more influential than they imagined. Grace, in parallel, thought in the do with that penthouse that he had acquired with so much effort. The idea of donating it began to take shape while was walking back to his apartment. There was past much of his life enduring contempt and minimization. But that day there was understood that his value did not need family approval. When thinking about women who, like her, had been belittled or silenced, decision became clear. That space should not be a poisoned gift for someone who had never had it. Valued, but a royal refuge for those who needed a new beginning. That certainty did smile for the first time in a lot time, not with irony, neither revenge, but with the serenity of having found a different purpose. Days after, the news of the donation was made public. Grace had officially transferred the penthouse at a women's shelter in transition, a place where victims of abuse and neglect could start over. Local newspapers picked up on it, and soon the media international also. They spread the history. The executive who turned a family humiliation into an opportunity to change lives. The faces of several beneficiaries appeared in articles, women who were grateful the possibility of having a decent and safe roof. Meanwhile, the Mitchell's surname was being discussed in business and social circles, but no longer associated with Victoria's superficial brilliance, but rather with Grace's decisive determination. If you are reading this story up to here, it means that the story really touched. You should tell me in the comments if you ever had to transform it the meaning of a wound to move forward. And above all, tell me where you are with us. It is inspiring to know that these words they travel to so many different cities. That echo of virtual solidarity accompanied the reality. The wedding was over in an awkward whisper, as Grace continued building a name that no longer depended on comparisons, neither approvals. Every message of support I received I remembered that I was not alone, that I had many people who understood the hardship of being underestimated by others, yours and hers, force necessary to get up without asking permission. Robert, seeing that the investor confidence was crumbling, he tried to organize an emergency meeting with a family business council. However, the calls were not answered with the same speed as always. 2 major financial contributions were canceled in a matter of hours, and the rumor that Victoria had tried to erase her own sister of the wedding spread quickly between circles where the reputation, it was everything. The St. Regis, witness to so many sumptuous events, became an he scenario where a couple saw to crack the foundation of her future. For Victoria, the impeccable dress and the expensive makeup was no longer enough. The glow had disappeared under the shadow of the true exposed. Grace, on the other hand, lived an absolute contrast. While the family was burning in reproaches and recriminations, she concentrated in his work. The gesture of donating the penthouse had not only strengthened its credibility professional, but also had marked a before and a after in his personal life. The company acknowledged his leadership and the promoted to vice president executive. The newspapers, which a few days ago would have ignored any motion yours, now they were looking for interviews. There the story was told not as that of someone who avenged a humiliation, but as that of a woman who knew how to convert he pain on purpose. In the middle of that unexpected attention, Grace kept the most important thing, the calm of knowing that I no longer had to prove anything to anyone. Victoria, desperate, appeared days after in Blackstone headquarters. He waited in the lobby for hours with his smudged makeup and a bouquet of flowers hands, as if that gesture could erase the cruelty with the one that was there excluded from his sister. He asked talk with Grace, first with supplications and then with demands. But the security protocol, it was clear. Only those who had an appointment, they could go up. From the top floor, Grace watched from afar that scene through a window. He didn't go down. He didn't go cruelty. It was a conscious decision to put limits where before I had allowed too many wounds. Instead of confronting face to face, Grace sent a short, direct, no, frills email. I was grateful he interested in reconcile, but made it clear that he needed definitive distance. There were no long reproaches, only the firmness of someone who had learned to protect himself. The mail closed with a powerful phrase, My life no longer depends on your approval. That seemingly simple line was the symbolic closing of a chapter that had lasted decades. In his office, while the phones kept ringing and the emails were piling up with invitations and recognitions, Grace allowed herself smile. Not out of pride empty, but because I understood that the true victory was not there in seeing his sister fall, but in having gotten up same. The shelter he received, the penthouse, began operating in a matter of weeks. The rooms, previously designed for a single luxury family, were adapted to accommodate dozens of women, with their children. The halls filled with voices new, of shy laughter and also of released cries, typical of those who finally found a safe place. Grace visited the place in private, without cameras nor journalists, and saw as a space that had been a symbol of ostentation was transformed in an opportunity for rebirth. That vision you gave more satisfaction than any contract signed or headlined in the newspapers. Meanwhile, in your closest environment, the family was divided. They defended Victoria, assuring that everything had been a misunderstanding, while others recognized in Grace the dignity that they had never known how to value. Family gatherings became tense, and in many cases they ceased to exist. Grace did not seek to mediate or convince anyone. She accepted that the cost of establishing limits were the loss of certain ties. With time, that decision became liberating. What would have previously felt like a punishment was now a reminder that family doesn't always mean support, and that the true respect is built beyond blood. As the months passed, Grace consolidated his new position in the company. Her colleagues began to see her not only as an efficient executive, but as someone with the courage to maintain the calm in half a personal hurricane. In short interviews, always diverted the focus towards a shelter, highlighting the importance of offering second chances to those who had been made invisible. He never mentioned the name of your sister. It was not necessary. The public already I knew the history and understood who had tried to erase it from a day that, ironically, ended up giving him elderly visibility. Victoria, on the other hand, lived the social hangover. Your name began to associate with phrases like the sister who excluded or the overshadowed bride. At later events, her presence caused uncomfortable murmurs, and little by little the invitations began to decrease. Robert, who had opted to reinforce his corporate image through marriage, was found dealing with investors who no longer trusted in his criterion. The brightness of both went out in silence, not for an explosive media scandal, but by that slow but relentless loss of credibility that turns people into footnotes. Meanwhile, Grace watched everything at once distance, without need to intervene. Life was in charge of settling scores. One night, while contemplated a New York skyline from her office window, Grace recalled how it all began in that St. Regis lobby. The feeling of being crossed off a list had been devastating, but now I understood that that blow was also the catalyst for a transformation inevitable. It wasn't about revenge, but about finding one's place without having to beg for it. The contrast between the silence of the lounge emptiness and the bustle far from the city you returned to certainty. There was stopped living in the shadow of others. Victoria's mail arrived weeks later, a long letter full of apologies, childhood memories, and promises of change. Grace read whole, calmly, in his modest apartment, much smaller than the penthouse he had given away. When he finished, he doubled the paper and the saved in an unanswered folder. I didn't feel hate nor nostalgia. I had only learned not to give space to those who they had injured in a way so conscious. The silence was his most honest answer. That night she slept deeply, convinced that she had closed a cycle and that the true freedom was found in not depending on the sorry alien to advance. With time, the shelter acquired notoriety own. The story of how there was born inspired donors and volunteers, and soon went from being a discrete project to a replicated model in other cities. Grace followed each development closely, not as a public figure, but as a collaborator. She visited the women, listened to their stories, and recognized in their eyes the same dull shine that she there was burdened for years. Helping them regain dignity became on a personal mission, that he remembered daily that the humiliation that he suffered was not an end, but the start of something bigger. For Victoria, the final blow was, accept that the last name no longer opened doors. He tried to return to the corporate world with Project Small, but the shadow of the occurred in the wedding, accompanied in every interview. Friends of convenience disappeared, and rumors about her haughty character spread. Proceeded. Even within the family, who before her they applauded began to distance themselves. In meetings where previously reigned its prominence, now there was chairs empty and awkward conversations. The contrast between the two sisters became evident. One had used the adversity to grow, the another to sink deeper into his own broken pride. Grace did not seek revenge in none of those outcomes. His energy, I was focused on continuing to grow and on keep his personal balance. He learned to enjoy things simple, walk through Central Park at dawn, cook at home without checking the phone every minute, accept invitations from friends that they valued unconditionally. Every small daily gesture was, in reality, an intimate victory that remembered how much had changed since that afternoon when they left out of the living room. His life no longer revolved around what they would think the others, but of the peace that she same had decided to build. The media. They continued to look for headlines with his name, but Grace chose the discretion. It allowed some interviews when I knew the focus would be he shelter or the project's social, never to feed the family morbidity. I knew that the wedding story was a magnet, but also understood that his real force was in, as had transformed that episode into something useful for others. That ability to choose what to show and what to reserve was, which finally gave he control that always had wanted. In silence, he became a reference for many people who they wrote privately thanking him the example of dignity. The years following confirmed that the Grace's decision had been a turning point, irreversible. The shelter managed to serve more than 40 women in its first year and expanded his ability with support of new donors. Some of them, in anonymous letters shared as that place to them had saved their lives, giving them the opportunity to escape abusive environments and start over. Grace read those testimonies silently, with tears held back, knowing that each word was a reminder that I had transformed a personal pain in hope collective. Victoria, in contrast, was left trapped in a spiral of failed attempts to regain prestige. Her marriage to Robert cracked under the pressure of the losses, financial and lack of confidence. Little by little, the couple, he stopped appearing at social events, and his circle shrank, drastically. The same people who once laughed at Grace now, they remained uncomfortably silent in the face of Victoria's fall. This irony was never celebrated by Grace, who preferred keep distance. For her, the true lesson, it was clear. It was not about proving who had more power, but to remember that the dignity is the only thing that should never be negotiated. Grace, from her new position as Vice President Executive, began leading projects international. I was traveling with frequency, signed important agreements, and, even thus, it was reserved time to remain linked to the shelter. Her colleagues admired his ability to maintain the humanity intact, in amidst astronomical figures and boardrooms filled with egos. This duality, a high-level executive and a woman committed to social causes, converted in a reference that transcended the corporate. It was not unusual for young people professionals they will seek to ask for advice, finding in she an example of resilience that was not taught in none university. In the personal, Grace too found space to heal. It was allowed open up to new friendships and a healthier emotional life, away from toxic relationships. The fear of being judged was left behind, replaced by the trust in his own criterion. Every step he took reinforced the certainty that the true success was not there in bombastic titles or in properties millionaires, but in the freedom to choose with who to share life with. Thus, the woman who a day was rejected in the door of the St. Regis became in someone who no longer needed to enter nowhere to validate herself. Now, It was her who decided that doors to open and which ones keep closed. That memory, from the envelope delivered in silence, followed appearing in his mind, but no longer as a wound open, but as a reminder of strength. Grace understood that her life had changed in that precise moment, when decided not to beg or argue, but to act with dignity. What seemed a day of humiliation had become the basis of everything that came after. That certainty accompanied at every work meeting, at every visit to the shelter, and even at the quiet moments of your home. It was the proof that a single day can completely redefine the course of a life. Victoria, for her part, left gradually fading from the social landscape. He tried to approach other business circles, but the distrust always preceded. The story of how treated his sister in the wedding had been turned a recurring rumor, impossible to erase. Privately, he sought reconciliations with some relatives, but he never managed to fully repair the broken image. His fall was not an abrupt scandal, but a slow erosion of credibility and respect. Grace did not celebrate that fall, only the observed as a natural consequence of years of accumulated contempt. She herself had decided to let go, and that the act of letting go was ultimately his elderly victory. With the years, the Mitchell's surname began to resonate differently, was not synonymous with luxury emptiness that Victoria had wanted to impose, but of Grace's achievements and the lives transformed thanks to her decision. In leadership conferences feminine, her name appeared as an example of resilience. However proposed, had become a symbol of how a wound could become an engine of change. Many people, especially women young people, that they were looking not to talk about investments, but to understand how to survive the contempt of the own family, and an identity is built without asking for validation. Grace never forgot what it felt like to be ignored in the door from the St. Regis. Didn't erase that I remember. It kept it as a compass. Every time he felt the temptation to remain silent or conform, he returned to that scene and remembered that the only non-negotiable thing was his dignity. The shelter continued growing up. She continued moving forward in his career, and the initial wound no longer hurt. It was a scar that told a story of overcoming, and in the days of elder tiredness, when the weight of the job was overwhelming, it was enough by looking at the faces of the women who found a home in that penthouse to know that it had all been worth it. Grace reached a balance that never imagined possible. Your name appeared in business reports, but also in opinion columns on philanthropy and social leadership. Unlike Victoria, who sought cameras and flashes, I preferred the discretion. Each recognition it received with humility, aware that its essential was not in the headlines but in the lives that were rebuilt under a safe roof. That vision that kept her focused, reminding her that the true power is not measured in applause, but in real impact. Victoria, on the other hand, was left trapped in a circle of resentment. He tried Aishi on more than one occasion to introduce himself in family gatherings with the same air of superiority as before, but the empty and the looks were evident. The distance had turned irreversible. In those meetings, Grace maintained the courtesy, without resentment, but without opening the door to the closeness. I had learned that the forgiveness does not always mean reconciliation. His limit was clear, and that emotional border allowed life with tranquility. The woman, who a day had been excluded, I no longer needed to enter no list. Now it was her who defined where I wanted to be, and with who. 1 year after, the shelter celebrated an intimate event to commemorate her anniversary. There was no red carpet or television cameras, just a group of women who shared their progress. Some had gotten a job stable, others had resumed studies, several had managed to regain custody of their children. Grace listened to each testimony in silence, with a knot in the air. Throat. I didn't need speak. His presence was already enough to remind them that all that space there was born of a day of pain transformed into action. As she left, one of the residents hugged him and whispered, "Thank you." It was a simple gesture, but more powerful than any multi-million-dollar contract he had signed. In his office, when falling in the afternoon, Grace looked back at the city from above. The noise of the transit arrived cushioned, and for the first time in a long time felt completely at peace. He remembered the insecure young woman who had arrived at the St. Regis with a simple dress and the hope of being accepted. That image contrasted with the woman she was now, safe, respected, and above all, free from the need to please. Life had shown that sometimes the greater gifts arrive disguised as rejection. That certainty became in her lighthouse, guiding her in every future decision, knowing that the dignity is never negotiated, nor not even with the own family.